You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 6,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, slipped under my apartment door while I slept. I almost stepped on it walking to the kitchen for coffee, the heavy paper crinkling under my bare foot. Official Department of Justice letterhead, the kind of thick stock they use for congressional commendations. But something about the typography looked wrong. The font was too sharp, too precise, like it had been pressed into the paper rather than printed. Mr. Nathaniel Greaves, it began in formal bureaucratic language that somehow felt personal, intimate even. The Office of Special Custody requires your expertise in federal corrections oversight. Your background in Supermax internal investigations makes you uniquely qualified for this position. I'd never heard of the Office of Special Custody, and I'd worked in federal corrections for 20 years. I knew every department, every subdivision, every acronym that moved paper through the system. But the letterhead looked authentic, complete with watermarks and security features I couldn't replicate with a home printer. When I held it up to the light, hidden text appeared, for those who see beyond the veil. The offer was staggering. Triple my previous salary at ADX Florence, full benefits, housing provided. The location was listed as Remote Facility, Monongahela, National Forest, West Virginia. The job description used phrases like specialized containment and individuals who present dangers beyond conventional incarceration. I should have thrown it away, should have recognized it as either an elaborate scam or something far worse. Instead, I found myself reading it again over breakfast, then again during lunch, memorizing details that seemed to shift slightly each time I looked at them. The coordinates at the bottom were handwritten in ink that appeared fresh despite the letter's official date from 2 weeks prior. My savings account was running thin since leaving my position in Colorado. The nightmares from my last case at ADX Florence haunted my sleep. Watching Ricardo Valenzuela tear his own throat open with a plastic spoon during what should have been a routine cell inspection had broken something in me. The way he'd smiled while blood poured from his neck, whispering coordinates in a language I didn't recognize, still visited me in the dark hours before dawn. My father's voice echoed in my head, warning me about taking jobs underground after what the mines had done to his lungs. The deep places change you, Nathaniel, he'd wheezed during his final weeks in the hospital. Some changes you can't come back from. But the money was substantial, and I'd sworn never to depend on anyone else for survival. The coordinates led me south through Pennsylvania's coal country, past abandoned strip mines and rusted equipment that looked like prehistoric skeletons. I'd grown up here, knew these roads, but somehow they felt unfamiliar in the October twilight. My GPS lost signal somewhere near an abandoned fire tower that shouldn't have existed, according to my maps, leaving me to navigate by handwritten directions that had come with the letter. The roads narrowed from interstate to state, highway to county route to something barely wide enough for my sedan. Gravel gave way to dirt, and dirt to what might generously be called a trail. Dense woods pressed in from both sides, old-growth forest that had somehow survived the lumber companies. Ancient CCC stone markers poked through decades of fallen leaves, their engraved dates worn smooth but still readable. 1936, 1937, 1938. I passed a rusted sign that read, "Entering Monongahela National Forest," though I couldn't remember seeing it on any official map. The trees grew thicker, their canopy blocking out what remained of daylight hours before sunset should have arrived. My headlights caught glimpses of structures through the woods. Collapsed fire towers, abandoned ranger stations, concrete foundations that might once have supported lookout posts, and shapes that didn't match any architecture I recognized. 20 minutes later, I almost missed the entrance entirely. A narrow break in the trees revealed a chain-link gate topped with razor wire that gleamed silver in my headlights. Beyond it stood a boarded chapel, its white paint peeling like diseased skin. A collapsed cemetery sprawled beside it, headstones tilting at impossible angles as if the ground beneath had shifted or been disturbed by something moving underneath. Faded federal property warnings hung from rusted posts, but no signs indicated what lay beyond. The warnings themselves were unusual, referencing subsections of federal code I'd never encountered and threatening prosecutions under laws that didn't sound familiar. Trespassers, subject to detention under Emergency Powers Act Section 17B, one read. Unauthorized personnel may be held indefinitely pending security review. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine running, headlights illuminating the scene. The chapel looked abandoned, forgotten, like something that had been deliberately erased from official records. But someone was maintaining the fence. The razor wire was new, bright steel that caught my headlights with sharp reflections, and the gate showed signs of recent use despite the rust on its frame. A security guard emerged from what I'd initially mistaken for a maintenance shed, tall and gaunt, wearing a uniform that seemed decades out of date, dark blue with brass buttons that belonged to an earlier era of federal service. His name tag read Morrison, but he didn't offer his first name or any greeting beyond checking my credentials against a handwritten list that looked like it had been compiled over years. "You're expected," he said in a voice that sounded like he'd been smoking unfiltered cigarettes for 40 years. His eyes never quite met mine, focusing somewhere over my left shoulder, as if he was seeing something behind me that I couldn't perceive. Elevators inside, Dr. Croft's waiting below. The shed's interior was larger than it appeared from outside, containing what looked like industrial equipment from the 1960s. A freight elevator with accordion gates occupied most of the space, its operator panel marked with floor numbers that went down instead of up. Morrison inserted an old-fashioned key and turned it with a grinding sound that suggested the mechanism was used regularly, despite its apparent age. "First time underground?" he asked as we descended. The elevator shuddered and creaked, dropping through what felt like solid bedrock through the metal framework of the elevator shaft. I caught glimpses of carved stone that didn't look like natural rock formation. "No," I said, "worked plenty of basement cells." He nodded but didn't elaborate. His weathered hands gripped the elevator controls with the familiarity of someone who'd made this journey thousands of times, but his knuckles were white with tension that suggested the trip never became routine. The walls passing by the elevator were reinforced concrete marked with original civil defense fallout shelter designations. Capacity 400 inches was stenciled in black letters beside radiation symbols and emergency procedures, dated 1962. Yellow and black civil defense triangles pointed toward what must be deeper levels, accompanied by warnings about radiation exposure and emergency protocols. The air grew colder as we dropped, carrying a metallic taste that settled on my tongue and refused to leave. By the third floor down, I could smell something else underneath the metallic tang. Disinfectant, industrial cleaning supplies, and something organic I couldn't identify, but that reminded me of the smell in hospital morgues. 6 stories down, the elevator opened onto a reception area that looked like a cross between a hospital and a Cold War bunker. The corridor stretched away in both directions, lined with white tiles that had probably been installed during the Eisenhower administration. Many were cracked or missing entirely, revealing concrete underneath that bore stains I didn't want to think about too carefully. Brass nameplates on heavy doors read Medical, Administrative, Supply, Isolation Ward A, Isolation Ward B, Emergency Procedures, and Classified Storage. The doors themselves looked like they'd been designed to withstand explosions, with multiple locking mechanisms and reinforcement that suggested whatever was behind them required serious security. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead in that irregular pattern that suggests failing ballasts, but the flickering followed a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. The shadows they cast moved independently, shifting and dancing despite the steady hum of the fixtures. A constant mechanical sound filled the air, like giant lungs breathing, the ventilation system working overtime to circulate stale underground atmosphere. Dr. Lydia Croft waited at the main reception desk, a massive piece of furniture that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of oak sometime during the Truman administration. She was mid-50s, professionally dressed in the kind of clinical manner that suggested extensive medical training, but her eyes kept darting to the security cameras mounted in every corner. "Mr. Greaves," she said, extending a hand that felt cold even in the underground chill. Her grip was firm but brief, as if prolonged contact made her uncomfortable. "Welcome to Ashcroft Containment Center. I'm Dr. Croft, Chief Medical Officer and Acting Administrator." She handed me a thick manila folder, held together with string ties. The kind of file system that predated computers by decades. The folder was heavier than it should have been, as if it contained more than paper. Along with it came a set of keys on a heavy iron ring that must have weighed 5 pounds. The keys were all different, some modern, some that looked like they belonged in a medieval castle, and a few made from metals I couldn't identify that felt warm to the touch despite the underground cold. "There are rules here," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested she'd delivered this speech many times but never gotten comfortable with it. "That must never be broken. Not bent. Not interpreted creatively. Never broken. Your predecessor learned that the hard way." She led me through corridors that branched and intersected in ways that seemed designed to confuse. Every turn revealed identical passages, the same white tiles, the same flickering lights, the same brass nameplates on heavy doors. I tried to memorize the route, but found myself losing track after the 4th turn, the passages seeming to fold back on themselves in geometrically impossible ways. We stopped at a sterile conference room where organizational charts, shift schedules, and emergency protocols covered the walls like wallpaper. Everything was handwritten in different hands, as if generations of staff had contributed to the documentation over decades. Some of the ink had faded to brown, suggesting documents that had been maintained since the facility's construction, while others looked fresh, despite being dated years in the past. "No computers," Dr. Croft explained, noticing my confusion as I searched for any digital equipment. "Digital systems experience what we call environmental interference, analog equipment only, handwritten records, manual procedures. It's more reliable in our specific circumstances." The rules she outlined were unlike anything I'd encountered in 20 years of corrections work. Inmates were identified by numbers only, never names. Staff members were forbidden from speaking inmates' full names aloud, even during private conversations or in written reports. Guards carried no weapons beyond iron restraints and wooden batons. No firearms, no tasers, no pepper spray. Nothing that could be taken and used against them. All surveillance used analog equipment, reel-to-reel tape machines, closed-circuit television with cathode ray tube monitors, mechanical time clocks that required physical winding every 12 hours. Digital systems, she repeated, experienced interference that made them unreliable for security purposes. She didn't elaborate on the nature of the interference, but her tone suggested the subject wasn't open for discussion. At dawn each day, A roll of souls had to be conducted. Every occupied cell number was called aloud in numerical order to maintain what she termed operational stability. The process took exactly 43 minutes and could not be abbreviated, delegated, or modified in any way. If the warden was unavailable, the facility would remain in lockdown until the roll call could be completed by authorized personnel. Some of our residents, she explained, leading me through the medical wing, require specialized accommodation beyond conventional corrections protocols. The examination rooms looked like something from a 1950s psychiatric hospital, but with modifications I'd never seen before. Copper mesh was embedded in the walls like some kind of Faraday cage, and the floors were lined with what looked like iron filings mixed into the concrete. The metal created patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift when I wasn't focusing on them. EEG machines sat beside hospital beds, their screens showing readouts that violated everything I knew about human brain function. Dr. Croft pulled up several examples pointing to wavelengths that curved in impossible directions and frequencies that registered outside the normal range of human and neural activity. Some readings showed simultaneous alpha, beta, theta, and delta waves, which, according to my basic understanding of brain science, couldn't occur in a living person. "We monitor all residents continuously," she said, making notes on a clipboard that never seemed to leave her hands. "Their neurological patterns provide early warning of behavioral changes that require immediate intervention." Isolation chambers were lined with salt crystals that caught the fluorescent light like tiny prisms. The crystals weren't decorative, they'd been embedded in the walls in precise geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, creating optical illusions that made the room seem both larger and smaller than its actual dimensions. Each chamber had a heavy steel door with multiple locking mechanisms, some mechanical, some electronic, and some that looked like they'd been designed for a bank vault. The supply rooms contained an inventory that read like the props department of a horror film, mixed with a military surplus store. Original 1950s civil defense rations sat alongside modern medical equipment. Boxes labeled iron filings, sea salt, blessed water, and copper wire occupied shelves next to standard pharmaceuticals. Other containers bore labels that made less sense: rare earth compounds, organic binding agents, electromagnetic neutralizers. When I asked about the unusual supplies, Dr. Croft simply said they were environmental necessities required for facility operations. She handed me a requisition form for monthly orders that included items I'd never seen on any prison supply list: consecrated materials, various denominations, rare earth metals, refined, organic compounds, agricultural grade, specialized restraint devices, iron construction. My temporary quarters were a converted office on the administrative level, furnished with a military surplus cot, a metal desk, and a rotary phone that connected to the facility's internal system. No outside line, no internet, no cell service 6 stories underground. The room's single window looked out onto another corridor rather than the surface, creating a disorienting sense of being inside a maze with no exit. A small adjoining bathroom contained the basics, and a closet held several sets of the standard uniform: dark blue shirts and pants, black boots, and a badge that read Federal Correctional Officer, without any facility identification. The uniform fit perfectly, despite my never having provided measurements, suggesting someone had been planning my arrival in considerable detail. That first night, I lay on the narrow cot, listening to the sounds of Ashcroft. The ventilation system maintained its constant mechanical breathing, a rhythm that seemed almost alive. Somewhere in the walls, pipes gurgled and settled with sounds that didn't quite match normal building maintenance. Occasionally footsteps echoed from the corridors above, too heavy and too measured to be casual patrol rounds. But there were other sounds too, voices, faint and distant, speaking in languages I couldn't identify. Sometimes they seemed to come from the ventilation ducts, sometimes from behind the walls themselves. The conversations were coherent, following patterns of question and response that suggested actual dialogue rather than random noise. I told myself it was acoustic tricks, sound carrying strangely through the concrete and steel, but the conversations were too organized to be coincidence. Names were mentioned, coordinates exchanged, information that seemed important despite being delivered in languages I didn't recognize. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of descending deeper into the earth, past levels that didn't exist on any architectural plans. In the dreams, my father was there, working in mines that connected to Ashcroft's lower levels, warning me about changes that happened to men who stayed too long in the deep places. The next morning, Dr. Croft provided orientation to the cell blocks. The architecture spoke of Cold War paranoia, translated into permanent construction. Thick concrete walls designed to withstand nuclear attack, narrow corridors that could be sealed with blast doors, heavy steel cell doors with observation windows reinforced with glass that looked bulletproof but reflected light in ways that suggested more exotic materials. The inmates' cells were identical: iron frame bed bolted to the floor, stainless steel toilet and sink, fluorescent light fixture protected by steel mesh. No personal items, no decorations, no evidence of long-term habitation, despite some inmates having been confined for decades. Each cell was 8 feet by 12 feet, exactly the minimum size required by federal standards, but the proportions felt wrong, as if the dimensions had been calculated according to criteria that had nothing to do with human comfort. Cell 107 housed Thomas Henley, according to his file, a former Marine sniper who'd been catatonic for 19 years. The arrest report made for disturbing reading. Detroit police had found him standing over 7 bodies in an abandoned warehouse, holding his service rifle, but with no ammunition in the chamber or anywhere in the building. No memory of how he'd gotten there, what had happened to the victims, or why he'd been in Detroit at all when his last known address was in North Carolina. The victims had been arranged in a precise geometric pattern that matched no known ritual or criminal signature in FBI databases. Each had been killed with surgical precision, using military techniques Thomas couldn't have known, targeting nerve centers and vital organs with knowledge that exceeded his documented training. When I looked through the observation window, he sat motionless on his bed, staring at the opposite wall with the 1,000-yard stare common to combat veterans. His military bearing was still evident, despite 2 decades of confinement. Straight back, squared shoulders, hands folded precisely in his lap. His hair had gone completely white, but his face showed no signs of aging, beyond what you'd expect from a man in his 50s. Then he spoke without moving his lips or shifting his gaze, voice barely audible through the steel door, but carrying clearly in the corridor's acoustics. Coordinates. Latitude and longitude spoken in the clipped, precise manner of military communication, delivered with the authority of someone calling in artillery strikes. I wrote them down without thinking, some instinct telling me the numbers were important. The coordinates were followed by additional information. Terrain descriptions, tactical assessments, casualty estimates, delivered in the emotionless tone of after-action reports. Later, when I checked those coordinates against missing persons databases using the facility's single computer terminal, they matched locations where bodies had been found across 3 states. Cases that had occurred while Thomas Henley was locked in his cell. Investigations that had concluded years after his arrest, with discoveries that perfectly matched his tactical assessments. Cell 203 contained Rebecca Walsh, a Boston paramedic whose file made for even more disturbing reading. She'd been arrested after a pattern of ritualistic murders committed while she was on duty, responding to emergency calls throughout the city. The victims were all elderly patients she'd been called to treat, individuals who should have died from natural causes but instead became part of something far more sinister. She'd performed the murders with medical precision, using techniques that suggested extensive knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, then continue with standard emergency procedures as if nothing had happened. The ritualistic elements were subtle but consistent: specific positioning of the bodies, items removed from the scene, symbols carved into surfaces that weren't discovered until detailed forensic analysis. Her defense attorneys had argued temporary insanity, but the prosecution presented evidence of careful planning and deliberate action spanning several years. What made the case truly unusual was Rebecca's complete lack of memory regarding the murders, combined with detailed knowledge of medical procedures she'd never been trained to perform. Psychiatric evaluation showed no signs of dissociative disorder or multiple personality syndrome. Her mind appeared completely integrated, with no gaps in memory or awareness beyond the specific incidents. She simply had no recollection of killing anyone, while possessing knowledge and skills that exceeded her documented education and experience. Her EEG readings, attached to her medical file, showed simultaneous waking and REM sleep patterns. According to the neurologist's notes, such readings were medically impossible in a living human being, yet they'd been documented daily for 12 years without variation. Her brain showed activity in regions that should be inactive, and complete silence in areas that should be constantly functioning. When I observed her through the cell window, she was sitting upright on her bed, with her eyes closed, lips moving silently, in what looked like a conversation with someone I couldn't see. Her hands gestured as if conducting an invisible orchestra, fingers tracing shapes in the air that seemed to follow some complex pattern beyond my understanding. The shapes hurt to follow with my eyes, creating a disorienting effect like looking at optical illusions designed to cause vertigo. When I tried to focus on her hand movements, my vision blurred and a headache began forming behind my eyes, forcing me to look away. Cell 317 held David Pratt, an Oklahoma farmer whose medical records defied everything I knew about human biology. According to the documentation, he hadn't eaten food or consumed water in 12 years, yet maintained perfect physical health. His vital signs were normal, his body weight unchanged from his intake examination over a decade ago, his blood work showing no signs of malnutrition or dehydration. Multiple prison doctors had documented his condition, each one initially skeptical until faced with years of evidence. Blood work showed normal levels of all essential nutrients, despite no intake of food or water. Brain scans revealed no abnormalities. Physical examinations found no signs of malnutrition, dehydration, or organ failure. By all medical standards, David Pratt should have died within weeks of his arrival at Ashcroft. His arrest had been equally mysterious. Police found him in the center of a wheat field that had been dying from drought, standing motionless while the crops around him grew green and healthy in a perfect circle extending 50 feet in all directions. He offered no explanation for the phenomenon and claimed no memory of how he'd come to be there. He acknowledged my presence with a slight nod when I looked through his window, then returned to staring at his hands as if seeing something invisible to everyone else. His fingers moved constantly, tracing patterns in the air similar to what I'd observed in Rebecca Walsh's cell, but more complex, more deliberate. The movements seemed to follow mathematical principles I couldn't grasp, creating shapes that existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. Each inmate displayed documented anomalies beyond their behavioral quirks. Electromagnetic readings around their cells fluctuated wildly for no apparent reason, sometimes spiking to levels that should have interfered with the facility's electrical systems. Security cameras malfunctioned in their presence, displaying static or simply going dark when pointed at certain cells for extended periods. Temperature readings in the cell blocks varied by as much as 20 degrees between individual cells, despite uniform heating and ventilation systems. Some cells remained perpetually cold, requiring inmates to be provided with additional blankets that were found torn and shredded each morning. Others maintained tropical temperatures that made the air shimmer with heat mirages despite being underground. They occasionally spoke in languages that, according to linguistic analysis reports filed by various university consultants, didn't correspond to any known human dialect. The sounds they made followed consistent grammatical structures and seemed to convey meaning, but the vocabulary was completely unknown. Some consultants had suggested the languages were artificial constructs, while others theorized they represented corrupted versions of dead languages that had been lost to history. During my second week, I began noticing things that made me question my sanity and my understanding of how buildings were supposed to function. The PA system would broadcast voices even when switched off, the speakers crackling to life with conversations in multiple languages. Maintenance insisted it was acoustic feedback from the ventilation system, but the voices spoke coherent sentences, sometimes responding to each other as if engaged in actual dialogue. I recognized some of the languages: Latin, Hebrew, what sounded like ancient Greek, and occasionally phrases in languages I'd heard during my army service in Afghanistan. Others were completely unfamiliar, containing sounds that didn't seem possible for human vocal cords to produce, clicks and whistles and tonal variations that hurt to listen to directly. The conversations never lasted long, usually cutting off the moment anyone approached a speaker to listen more carefully. But during the brief moments they were audible, they seemed to be discussing facility operations, staff schedules, and details about personnel that weren't contained in any official records. In the administrative offices, I found my own photograph in a classified file cabinet, attached to documents dated 1985. I would have been 12 years old then, living with my father, in a Pennsylvania coal town hundreds of miles from anywhere the federal government would have had reason to photograph me. But the photo showed me, as I look now, wearing the same clothes I'd put on that morning, standing in a location I didn't recognize. The file contained detailed psychological evaluations covering my entire life, family history, going back 3 generations, and what appeared to be surveillance reports documenting my responses to various situations throughout my career in corrections. Someone had been watching me for decades, recording my methods for handling difficult inmates, my psychological responses to high-stress incidents, my adaptation to working in underground facilities. Medical records included information I'd never provided to any doctor, childhood injuries I'd hidden from my parents, psychological traumas I'd never discussed with anyone, physical characteristics that weren't apparent to casual observation. The level of detail suggested surveillance that went far beyond normal government background checks. Inmates began calling me Warden Greaves before I'd introduced myself to any of them or been officially appointed to that position. The previous administrator had been acting warden according to organizational charts, but according to my paperwork, I was being brought in as permanent replacement. Somehow the inmates knew this before I did, addressing me with a title I hadn't been told I would receive. When I mentioned the incidents to Dr. Croft, she nodded, as if she'd expected it, making notes on her clipboard with the careful attention of someone documenting expected results rather than recording surprises. Resonance drift, she explained, using a term I'd never encountered in correctional literature or psychology training. Staff members gradually synchronize with our residents. It's a natural adaptation to the specialized environment. Nothing to be concerned about, but we monitor it carefully to ensure optimal operational efficiency. I asked about my predecessor, the previous warden, whose name appeared on some of the older paperwork but wasn't mentioned in any current documentation. Dr. Croft grew quiet, checking her watch before answering as if the question required careful timing. Administrator Johnson requested early retirement after developing behavioral irregularities, occupational hazard of working in specialized containment environments. He's living comfortably in Florida now, enjoying his pension and pursuing interests that were impossible while working in classified operations. Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but she changed the subject before I could ask follow-up questions. Her clipboard never left her hands, and I noticed she was constantly taking notes about everything I said and did, documenting my responses with the thoroughness of someone conducting a psychological evaluation. Later, when I searched through the personnel files using my administrative access, I found no forwarding address for Administrator Johnson, no retirement paperwork, no indication of where he'd gone or when he'd left. His personnel file ended abruptly 18 months before my arrival, with a final evaluation that mentioned successful completion of surface integration protocols, without explaining what that meant. The facility's deeper archives, which I accessed using my master key, revealed Ashcroft's true history and the reasons for its unusual operational procedures, built in the aftermath of something called Project Charybdis, a classified Cold War program that had operated from 1952 to 1967. The facility had originally been constructed as a fallout shelter for high-ranking government officials during nuclear emergencies. Project Charybdis, according to the declassified documents I found in boxes that hadn't been opened in decades, had involved experiments in what the reports termed controlled possession, using death row inmates from federal prisons across the country. The researchers had been investigating reports of unexplained behavioral changes in certain prisoners, cases where violent criminals suddenly displayed knowledge and abilities they couldn't possibly have acquired through normal means. The experiments had involved exposing subjects to various stimuli, electromagnetic fields, infrasound frequencies, chemical compounds derived from organic sources, and what the reports vaguely described as biological materials of unknown origin recovered from sites of anomalous activity. The goal had been to determine whether the observed phenomena could be induced, controlled, and potentially weaponized for military applications. Ashcroft had served as the primary research facility until the project was terminated following what the documents called a containment failure, resulting in multiple casualties and the loss of primary research personnel. The details were heavily redacted, but the aftermath was clear. The facility had been repurposed as a permanent containment center for subjects who couldn't be released or transferred to conventional prisons. The reports described inmates whose conditions had stabilized into what researchers termed symbiotic relationships with entities of unknown origin. Rather than being possessed in the traditional sense, they had achieved what appeared to be cooperative arrangements with consciousness that existed independently of human neural systems. The prison served dual functions that became clear as I read through decades of research reports and administrative documentation. On the surface, it was described as containment, a place to hold individuals who presented dangers beyond conventional incarceration. But the classified documents revealed its true nature as an ongoing laboratory, where researchers continued to track the long-term effects of whatever had been done to the original test subjects. The government had been monitoring how long certain entities could inhabit human hosts without causing permanent damage, studying the adaptation mechanisms that allowed some individuals to maintain their sanity, while others were completely overwhelmed. Each inmate represented a case study in supernatural possession that had somehow become the responsibility of the federal correction system. Night shifts proved most unsettling for reasons that went beyond the usual challenges of working underground. Guards reported hearing their names whispered from empty cells, finding doors they'd locked standing open minutes later, discovering personal items they'd never seen before in their lockers. The analog security cameras captured movement in the corridors, shadows that didn't correspond to any physical presence in the facility. Morrison, the guard who'd met me on arrival, had worked at Ashcroft for 15 years. During a quiet moment in the break room, surrounded by coffee-stained furniture that looked like it had been salvaged from government offices in the 1970s, he told me about his first week on the job. "Heard my dead mother calling my name from cell 394, he said, stirring sugar into coffee that had gone cold hours ago. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, whether from too much caffeine or too many years of underground work. Cell 394's been empty for 3 years, but I heard her voice clear as day, asking why I never visited her grave after the funeral. He'd investigated, found the cell empty and properly locked, but continued to hear his mother's voice during every night shift for months afterward. The voice knew things about his childhood that no one else could have known. Memories he'd never shared with anyone. Family secrets that had died with her. Eventually he'd learned to ignore it, treating the phenomenon as just another part of working at Ashcroft. But the experience had changed him in ways he couldn't articulate, making him more sensitive to sounds and movements that other people couldn't perceive. "You'll hear things too," he warned, meeting my eyes for the first time since I'd arrived. "Voices from your past, people you thought you'd forgotten. Don't answer them. Don't acknowledge them. Just do your job and pretend you don't hear anything unusual. It's easier if you don't fight it." Other guards shared similar stories during quiet moments when they thought no one was listening. Voices of childhood friends who died in accidents, deceased relatives offering advice about current problems, former colleagues discussing cases they'd worked together years before. The phenomena seemed to target personal memories, drawing on experiences that no one else should have known about. The voices weren't random or malicious. They seemed to understand each person's psychological vulnerabilities and offered comfort or guidance tailored to individual needs. But accepting their help came with a price that none of the guards could clearly explain, changes in perception and behavior that accumulated over time. 3 weeks into my tenure, the power failed during a routine medical transfer, an event that transformed my understanding of what Ashcroft really was. The lights went out in stages, starting with the outer corridors and moving inward, like a wave of darkness consuming the facility. The backup generators kicked in within seconds, but the constant infrasound hum that filled Ashcroft's corridors went silent for the first time in decades. In that sudden quiet, every inmate began chanting simultaneously. Their voices carried clearly through the steel doors, some recognizable as Latin or Hebrew, others completely foreign, but following rhythms that seemed designed to resonate with the facility's architecture. The chanting wasn't random, it followed a complex pattern building towards something that made the air itself feel heavy with potential. The effect on the staff was immediate and terrifying. Guard Peterson, a 20-year veteran with commendations for handling violent incident, and a reputation for unflappable calm under pressure, suddenly turned on his partner without warning. His eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and he began clawing at his face while screaming coordinates in a voice that sounded nothing like his own. The voice that came from Peterson's mouth was deeper, older, speaking with authority that belonged to someone accustomed to commanding armies, rather than supervising prison corridors. The coordinates were delivered in multiple languages, accompanied by tactical assessments and casualty estimates that suggested knowledge of military operations spanning centuries. It took 4 men to restrain him, as blood streamed down his face and he continued shouting numbers that would later prove significant. The coordinates he screamed corresponded to a decommissioned missile silo 30 miles away, but also to battlefields from wars that had ended decades before Peterson was born, archaeological sites where mass graves had been discovered, and locations where unexplained phenomena had been reported throughout history. Emergency lockdown engaged automatically when the power failed, a system designed to contain any security breaches until normal operations could be restored. Hydraulic steel doors slid shut throughout the facility, sealing off sections with a finality that suggested they weren't designed to open easily. Each door was engraved with protective symbols, biblical verses, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Sanskrit characters I couldn't read, mathematical formulas that looked more like magical incantations than engineering calculations. The backup generators restored power to essential systems within minutes, but the infrasound system remained offline for 3 hours, while maintenance traced the problem to what they called environmental interference. The technical explanation involved electromagnetic fluctuations and harmonic resonance that sounded plausible, but didn't account for the synchronized response from inmates who couldn't have communicated with each other. During those 3 hours, the chanting continued, growing louder and more complex as additional voices joined the chorus. Some sounded human, but others carried tones and harmonics that suggested vocal cords adapted for purposes beyond normal speech. The sound filled the corridors, echoing off concrete and steel in ways that made it impossible to determine its source or direction. Staff reported seeing figures in corridors that weren't captured on security cameras, hearing conversations in languages that shouldn't exist, finding handwritten notes in cells that had been vacant during the last inspection. The notes were written in various hands, some recognizable as belonging to current inmates, others matching the handwriting of prisoners who had died years before. The handwriting analysis revealed something impossible. The notes were written in ink that hadn't dried despite being found on surfaces that had been cleaned hours earlier. When touched, they crumbled to dust, leaving stains on fingers that couldn't be washed away for days. When the infrasound system finally came back online, its characteristic hum filling the facility once again, the incident stopped immediately. The chanting ceased mid-syllable, the apparitions vanished, and the mysterious notes crumbled to dust when exposed to the restored frequency. Peterson recovered with no memory of the event, but the coordinates he'd screamed proved significant in ways that expanded my understanding of what we were really dealing with. Investigation teams dispatched to the primary location found the site he had indicated, discovering the remains of 7 hikers who had disappeared in 1987. The bodies were arranged in a ritual pattern that exactly matched crime scenes from Rebecca Walsh's case files, crimes she'd committed while the hikers were already dead and buried. The positioning was identical, down to the placement of personal items, the orientation of limbs, and symbols carved into nearby trees that matched photographs from her Boston murder scenes. That discovery prompted a comprehensive review of other coordinates provided by Thomas Henley during his catatonic episodes over the past 19 years. Investigation teams were dispatched to dozens of locations, finding additional bodies at each site, victims of unsolved crimes that had occurred while both Thomas and Rebecca were locked in their cells hundreds of miles away. The connections were impossible, according to conventional logic, but the evidence was undeniable. Crime scenes separated by decades and thousands of miles showed identical ritual elements, suggesting either an organized conspiracy spanning generations or something far more disturbing than coordinated criminal activity. The next day I received my first direct communication from Administrator Stone, a figure whose existence I'd begun to doubt despite his signature appearing on documents throughout Ashcroft's files. A handwritten note delivered through internal mail by Morrison, who claimed he'd found it on his desk without seeing who left it, congratulated me on handling the emergency with appropriate professionalism and requested a detailed report on staff behaviour during the incident. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, but the paper felt warm to the touch despite having been delivered through the facility's cold corridors. When I held it up to the light, additional text became visible. Your adaptation exceeds expectations. Preparation for advanced responsibilities will begin shortly. I'd never met Administrator Stone, never spoken with him by phone, never seen any evidence. of his physical presence at the facility, but his signature appeared on documents dating back decades, authorizing everything from supply orders to personnel decisions with remarkable consistency despite the span of years involved. Dr. Croft claimed to receive regular communications from him, but she couldn't provide any contact information or explain why he never visited the facility in person. When pressed for details about their interactions, she became evasive, checking her watch and clipboard as if the questions required careful timing and documentation. Administrator Stone operates from the regional office, she explained in the tone of someone repeating a memorized response. His responsibilities encompass multiple facilities across several states. Direct visits are limited to emergency situations or significant operational changes. But there was no regional office in any government directory I could access, no organizational chart that showed Ashcroft's place within the federal correction system, no budget documents that accounted for our operations or personnel costs. The facility existed in a bureaucratic vacuum that suggested funding and oversight from sources not subject to normal governmental transparency. That night, I broke into the classified records vault, using my master keys, searching for answers about Administrator Stone and the true nature of Ashcroft's operations. The vault occupied an entire room lined with filing cabinets that looked like they'd been in place since the facility's construction, their metal surfaces bearing the kind of wear that suggested decades of regular use. Among hundreds of manila folders, I found my own personnel file, thicker than any employment record had a right to be, and containing information that should have been impossible to obtain. The contents were disturbing beyond anything I'd experienced at Ashcroft, documenting surveillance that had apparently begun during my childhood and continued throughout my adult life. Detailed psychological evaluations going back to elementary school, surveillance reports covering my military service and corrections career, medical records that included information I'd never provided to any doctor or government agency. Someone had been studying me for decades, documenting my responses to stress, my methods for handling difficult situations, my psychological adaptation to working in underground environments. The evaluations include assessments of my compatibility with non-standard operational environments and adaptation potential for enhanced responsibilities. Graphs tracked my psychological development over time, predicting how I would respond to various scenarios with accuracy that suggested the predictions had been tested and refined through actual observation. Most disturbing was a section titled Projected Integration Timeline that outlined my expected behavioral changes week by week, predicting how I would adapt to working at Ashcroft with precision that had proven remarkably accurate. The predictions described my initial confusion, growing acceptance of unusual procedures, and gradual synchronization with what the file called facility resonance. The timeline included specific milestones: when I would begin hearing the inmates' communications clearly, when I would stop questioning unusual procedures, when I would develop emotional attachment to the facility's mission. Each milestone was marked with dates that corresponded exactly to my actual experiences, suggesting the document had been prepared by someone with intimate knowledge of how the integration process worked. A projected host date was circled in red ink, listing my name with the current date, plus 18 months. The terminology suggested something more than simple job performance evaluation, implying a process that would fundamentally alter my identity and relationship with the facility. Previous Warden's files revealed a pattern that filled me with dread, while simultaneously feeling inevitable, as if I was discovering something I'd always known, but hadn't consciously acknowledged. Each had served exactly 18 months before requesting transfer or early retirement, but the transfer requests were never approved, and the retirement destinations were never documented. Medical evaluations showed progressive behavioral changes that followed the same pattern in every case. Increased aggression toward external oversight, growing emotional attachment to inmates, reports of hearing voices that weren't there, and eventually what the files described as complete integration with facility operations. The changes weren't side effects of working in a difficult environment. They were planned developments, carefully monitored and documented as part of what appeared to be an ongoing experiment in human adaptation to supernatural circumstances. Each warden represented a test subject whose psychological transformation was being studied and refined for future applications. A memorandum dated 3 months before my arrival, signed by Administrator Stone, in the same precise handwriting I'd seen on recent communications, outlined plans for my integration process. The document described Ashcroft not as a prison or research facility, but as a breeding ground for sustainable containment solutions. The memo explained that traditional containment methods were insufficient for the entities housed at Ashcroft. Physical barriers could hold their host bodies, but the entities themselves required constant management by personnel capable of communicating with them directly. This communication was only possible after extensive psychological adaptation that conventional staff members couldn't achieve. The entities required human hosts to maintain stability in physical reality, but they also needed intermediaries who could serve as translators and coordinators. Staff members who underwent successful integration became these intermediaries, developing abilities that allowed them to manage supernatural phenomena while maintaining enough human consciousness to handle administrative responsibilities. The vault contained one more revelation that changed everything I thought I understood about Ashcroft and my role within its operations. Architectural plans showed the facility extended far deeper than the 6 levels I'd seen, with sub-basements stretching down another 4 stories into bedrock that had been excavated far beyond what fallout shelter construction would have required. The lower levels were marked only as archive storage and special projects, but hand-drawn annotations in margins suggested much more complex purposes. References to primary containment, entity interface, and personnel integration accompanied detailed specifications for equipment and procedures that weren't described in any official documentation. My security clearance didn't grant access to those areas, but I could hear sounds coming from below during quiet moments, footsteps, voices, and mechanical operations that suggested ongoing activity in areas that were supposed to be abandoned storage. The sounds followed patterns that coincided with the facility's operational schedule, intensifying during shift changes and becoming quieter during normal working hours. Equipment manifests included items that made no sense for storage areas: medical monitoring devices, communication equipment, living quarters, and what appeared to be ceremonial chambers designed for purposes that weren't specified in any official documentation. The lower levels weren't storage at all, but active operational areas housing activities that required security clearances beyond what surface personnel possessed. The realization that Ashcroft extended far beyond what I'd been shown came with an understanding that my integration timeline was leading toward responsibilities in those hidden areas. The 18-month surface assignment was training, preparation for work that required the enhanced awareness developed through prolonged exposure to the facility's unique environment. Previous wardens hadn't retired or been transferred. They had graduated to responsibilities that required capabilities beyond normal human limitations, taking on roles in the deeper levels, where the boundary between conventional corrections and supernatural management dissolved entirely. The next morning's roll of souls proceeded differently than any since my arrival at Ashcroft. As I read each cell number aloud over the facility's PA system, the inmates responded not with their assigned numbers but with my name, creating a chorus that echoed through the corridors with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible in the concrete and steel environment. "Nathaniel Greaves," they whispered in unison, voices carrying clearly through the thick steel doors despite the fact that they shouldn't have been able to hear each other or coordinate their responses. The sound multiplied and reflected off the facility's surfaces, creating overtones that made the walls themselves seem to vibrate in resonance. Dr. Croft observed from the medical station, taking notes with intensity that suggested she was documenting a significant milestone rather than routine behavior. Her clipboard had been replaced by a thick notebook, and she wrote constantly, recording everything I said and did with the thoroughness of someone conducting a psychological evaluation. When I asked about the inmates' behavior, she explained it was completely normal during transition periods, with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions were being confirmed. New wardens typically experience increased attention from residents as they adapt to their role, she said, her clinical tone not quite masking what sounded like anticipation. It indicates successful integration with facility operations and readiness for expanded responsibilities. The infrasound system pulsed with a different frequency that afternoon, one that created physical sensations I'd never experienced before. The subsonic vibrations seemed to resonate with my bones, creating harmonics that made my vision blur and my hands shake in rhythm with the mechanical pulse. The inmates began reciting details about my childhood in Pennsylvania, my father's death in the mines, memories I'd never shared with anyone, living or dead. They knew about the nightmares that had plagued me since childhood, dreams of working in tunnels that connected to vast underground spaces where voices spoke in languages that predated human civilization. They knew about the voices I'd heard in the coal mine tunnels when I was young, accompanying my father on days when school was closed and he couldn't find childcare. The voices had spoken to me then too, offering knowledge about the deep places and the entities that dwelt in spaces between solid rock and empty air. They knew my daily routines better than I did, describing my habits, my thoughts, my fears with accuracy that suggested constant observation by intelligences that existed independent of security cameras or conventional surveillance. But the monitoring equipment showed only normal facility operations, recording nothing unusual despite the ongoing commentary about my every movement and decision. By evening count, several inmates had stopped responding to their numbers entirely. Instead, they narrated my actions in real time, describing my movements as I performed them, commenting on my thoughts as I formed them, offering advice about decisions I hadn't yet realized I needed to make. Thomas Henley's voice carried from cell 107 with military precision. Warden Greaves is walking toward the administrative office. He's thinking about the files he read last night. He's wondering if he can trust Dr. Croft, but he's already beginning to understand that trust is the wrong framework for understanding relationships in this environment. Rebecca Walsh added from cell 203 with medical authority, his physiological adaptation is proceeding faster than average. Blood pressure elevated but stable, heart rate variable but within acceptable ranges. The integration process is affecting his autonomic nervous system in ways that will enhance his ability to perceive non-physical phenomena. David Pratt concluded from cell 317. With philosophical certainty, he's beginning to hear us properly now. Not just the words, but the meanings behind them. Soon he'll be able to participate in conversations that transcend the limitations of verbal communication. Their commentary continued throughout the evening, providing running analysis of my psychological state, physical condition, and spiritual development with expertise that suggested decades of experience in human transformation processes. They weren't just observing my integration, they were actively participating in it, guiding the process with knowledge that conventional psychology couldn't provide. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing transfer request forms and resignation letters I'd drafted, but couldn't bring myself to send. The paperwork sat on my desk like artifacts from a previous life, documents that addressed concerns I no longer felt and expressed desires for a future that had become irrelevant. I could leave immediately, drive back to Pittsburgh, report Ashcroft to federal authorities and hope someone would believe a story that I was beginning to understand was true, in ways that transcended normal concepts of reality. But the inmates' voices echoed through the walls, calling my name, describing my thoughts as I formed them, and I realized that leaving might not be possible, even if I wanted to. The entities inhabiting Thomas, Rebecca, and David weren't prisoners in the conventional sense. They were teachers, preparing me for responsibilities that would utilize capabilities I was only beginning to develop. The integration process wasn't something being done to me. It was something I was actively participating in, choosing moment by moment to embrace changes that conventional psychology would classify as pathological, but that felt more like awakening from a dream that had lasted my entire adult life. The rotary phone on my desk rang once, a sharp bell that cut through the facility's ambient noise and seemed to resonate with frequencies I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. When I answered, Administrator Stone's voice greeted me for the first time, but it sounded familiar, as if I'd heard it before in dreams or half-remembered conversations from childhood. "Good evening, Warden Greaves," he said, his tone warm and paternal but carrying authority that belonged to someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "I trust you're adapting well to your new responsibilities." I'd been expecting his call, though I couldn't explain why. The voice triggered memories that felt important but remained just beyond conscious recollection. Conversations that might have taken place in the coal mines of my childhood, or in dreams that had shaped my understanding of underground spaces long before I'd encountered Ashcroft. "I have some questions about the facility," I began, but he interrupted gently with the patience of someone who had conducted similar conversations many times before. "All your questions will be answered in time," he said with certainty that suggested he knew exactly what I wanted to ask and why. "For now, focus on your duties. The residents are responding well to your presence. Dr. Croft tells me you're showing excellent adaptation to our specialized environment." His approval carried weight that seemed disproportionate to his administrative role, creating satisfaction that felt like recognition from a mentor I'd been seeking, without realizing it. The conversation lasted only minutes, but it left me with the sense that important decisions had been made and approved, setting processes in motion that would determine my future in ways I didn't yet understand. He hung up before I could ask the questions that had been troubling me, but somehow I felt reassured by the conversation, as if his recognition was something I'd been seeking throughout my career without understanding what I was really looking for. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine that felt increasingly natural, as if I was remembering how to perform duties I'd known how to do long before arriving at Ashcroft. The morning roll call became a meditation, the inmates' responses a familiar chorus that helped me start each day with purpose and direction. The voices in the walls became companionable rather than disturbing, offering advice about facility management, warning me of potential problems before they developed, and providing insights into the inmates' conditions that helped me make decisions with confidence that exceeded my official training and experience. I stopped questioning the unusual procedures and began to see them as necessary adaptations to circumstances that conventional corrections couldn't accommodate. The analog equipment, the handwritten records, the specialized medical monitoring, the protective symbols on doors and walls, everything served purposes that became obvious once I developed the sensitivity to perceive what we were really dealing with. The facility's unique acoustic properties, electromagnetic characteristics, and atmospheric conditions weren't environmental challenges to be overcome, but tools to be utilized in managing entities that existed partially outside normal physical reality. Ashcroft had been designed by people who understood the requirements for containing and communicating with consciousness that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. I understood now that the prison wasn't just a containment facility or research laboratory. It was a symbiotic organism that required careful tending to maintain the delicate balance between human reality and something far older and more complex. The inmates weren't prisoners in the conventional sense. They were essential components of a system designed to prevent something far more dangerous than individual criminal behavior. The entities that inhabited them were ancient, patient, and incredibly intelligent. They had been waiting for someone with the right combination of experience, psychological stability, and intuitive understanding to serve as their permanent liaison with human authority structures. Previous wardens had been temporary solutions, placeholders until the right person could be found and properly prepared. Dr. Croft explained this during one of our regular meetings, her clinical demeanour replaced by something approaching reverence, as she described the facility's true purpose and my role within it. "You're not like the others," she said, reviewing my adaptation reports with satisfaction that suggested years of careful planning were finally coming to fruition. Previous administrators fought the process, tried to maintain their original identities and resist the changes that were necessary for effective performance of their duties. You're embracing the integration naturally, allowing yourself to become what the facility needs. Her observation felt accurate but incomplete. I wasn't fighting the changes because they felt like corrections, rather than losses, adjustments that aligned my consciousness with purposes I'd been unconsciously seeking throughout my career in corrections. The integration process was revealing capabilities I'd always possessed, but never had opportunities to develop. The inmates had begun speaking to me directly during my rounds, no longer limiting themselves to assigned numbers or formal roll call procedures. They offered glimpses of knowledge that spanned centuries, insights into human behavior that helped me understand not just individual cases, but the broader patterns of consciousness evolution that shaped human history. Thomas Henley shared tactical knowledge from conflicts I'd never heard of, military strategies that could be applied to managing difficult staff situations and maintaining security in environments where conventional force was ineffective. His expertise extended beyond documented military history, encompassing warfare techniques that predated recorded civilization, but remained relevant to current challenges. Rebecca Walsh provided medical insights that helped me understand the physiological aspects of the integration process, explaining how human neurology adapted to perceive and process information that existed beyond normal sensory input. Her knowledge encompassed medical procedures that wouldn't be developed by conventional science for decades, if ever. David Pratt offered philosophical perspectives that put the entire experience into cosmic context, describing humanity's relationship with consciousness entities as part of an evolutionary process that had been ongoing for millennia. His insights helped me understand that what was happening at Ashcroft wasn't an aberration, but a natural development in the expansion of human awareness. They were teachers as much as inmates, preparing me for responsibilities I was only beginning to comprehend. The facility extended far beyond the levels I'd seen, down into regions where the boundary between physical and spiritual reality became meaningless, and where previous administrators now served as guides for newly integrated personnel. My 18-month timeline approached with a sense of anticipation, rather than dread. The transition would involve moving to the lower levels, taking on administrative responsibilities that required the enhanced awareness developed through integration with facility operations. I would continue to serve as warden, but my understanding of what that meant had evolved considerably from my initial conception of prison administration. The surface duties that had once seemed challenging now felt routine, limited by conventional administrative requirements that prevented me from fully utilizing the insights I'd gained through the integration process. The real work of managing supernatural phenomena required capabilities that could only be developed through direct experience with entities whose existence transcended normal human understanding. The final weeks of my surface tenure were marked by increased activity throughout the facility as new inmates arrived regularly. Individuals whose crimes suggested possession by entities similar to those already contained at Ashcroft were being transferred from prisons across the country, cases that local authorities couldn't handle through conventional procedures. The organization was growing, expanding its operations to handle increasing numbers of cases being reported worldwide. Whatever phenomenon had created the original Ashcroft inmates was accelerating, requiring enhanced capabilities for identification, containment, and management of affected individuals. Administrator Stone visited in person for the first time, appearing in my office one morning as if he'd always been there, sitting in the chair across from my desk with the familiarity of someone who had occupied that space countless times before. He was younger than I'd expected, with the kind of ageless quality that suggested extensive experience with processes that transcended normal human aging. "You've exceeded our expectations," he said, reviewing my performance files with pleasure that felt like approval from a mentor whose recognition I'd been seeking throughout my career. Most administrators require significant encouragement to accept their new circumstances. You've embraced the transition with remarkable grace. His physical presence confirmed what I'd begun to suspect about his true nature and role within Ashcroft's operations. He wasn't simply an administrative supervisor, but someone who had undergone the same integration process, achieving a level of enhancement that allowed him to maintain normal human appearance while operating with capabilities that conventional psychology couldn't account for. He explained that my surface duties would continue for another month, time needed to prepare the next candidate for eventual integration. My replacement had already been selected, a former corrections inspector from Texas whose psychological profile suggested excellent compatibility with facility operations. "Dr. Elena Martinez has experience with unusual cases," he said, consulting files that contained more information about her background than any normal employment screening would have gathered, but nothing quite like Ashcroft. She'll need careful guidance during her adaptation period. The mention of my replacement created an unexpected surge of protective instinct regarding the facility and its mission. The idea of someone else taking my position, potentially struggling with the integration process that had become so natural for me, seemed almost tragic. Ashcroft had needs that couldn't be met by someone fighting against the facility's requirements. Her psychological profile shows some resistance factors, Administrator Stone continued, pointing to evaluations that highlighted potential problems. Religious background that might conflict with our operational realities, military experience that could create inflexibility regarding unconventional procedures. But her core competencies suggest she'll adapt successfully with proper guidance. The prospect of training a newcomer filled me with purpose I hadn't expected. I understood now why Dr. Croft had seemed so invested in my successful adaptation, monitoring my progress with attention that went beyond professional responsibility. We were all part of something larger, a carefully maintained ecosystem that required each component to function properly for the whole system to survive. Over the following days, I prepared for Dr. Martinez's arrival with the same attention to detail I'd once applied to investigating prison riots. I reviewed her psychological profile, studying her response patterns to stress and authority, her methods for handling difficult situations, her documented reactions to events that exceeded conventional explanation. The inmates seemed aware of the impending change before I'd mentioned it to anyone, demonstrating the enhanced perception that allowed them to gather information through means that transcended normal sensory input. During the morning roll call, they began offering advice about managing new staff members, sharing insights about human adaptation that suggested centuries of experience with personnel transitions. "The new one will be frightened," Thomas Henley observed during one of our corridor conversations, speaking with the authority of someone who had guided many previous transitions. "Fear makes the integration process more difficult, creating resistance that prolongs adaptation and increases the risk of psychological damage. She'll need reassurance that the changes she experiences are beneficial rather than threatening." Rebecca Walsh added her medical perspective with clinical precision. "Monitor her sleep patterns and appetite during the first month. Physical symptoms often manifest before psychological acceptance, creating a cascade of physiological stress that can interfere with neural adaptation. Address the physical aspects promptly, and the mental integration will follow more naturally. David Pratt provided the philosophical framework that encompassed broader implications. She must understand that she's not losing her identity, but expanding it beyond current limitations. The person she was before arriving at Ashcroft was merely preparation for who she's becoming. Resistance to that growth creates suffering that serves no useful purpose. Their advice proved remarkably prescient when Dr. Elena Martinez arrived the following Monday morning, her reaction to Ashcroft demonstrating the resistance factors that Administrator Stone had identified in her psychological evaluation. Where I had felt curious apprehension during my first descent, she radiated barely controlled anxiety that suggested deep-seated fears about underground spaces and supernatural phenomena. Morrison met her at the gate with the same professional courtesy he'd shown me, but her response to the descent was markedly different from my own experience. Where I'd been fascinated by the facility's unique architecture and historical significance, she seemed disturbed by elements that should have been reassuring to someone with her corrections background. Dr. Croft conducted her orientation with the same clinical professionalism she'd shown me, but Elena's questions were more probing and skeptical than curious. She wanted to know about oversight procedures, administrative reviews, contact protocols with external agencies, regulatory compliance, and budgetary accounting. The questions I should have asked, but somehow hadn't thought to pursue. The Office of Special Custody operates with considerable autonomy, Dr. Croft explained patiently, using phrases that had satisfied me but clearly didn't address Elena's concerns. Our mission requires flexibility in operational procedures that might seem unusual in conventional corrections environments, but everything we do is authorized under classified directives that supersede normal regulatory frameworks. Elena's discomfort was obvious as we toured the facility, her corrections background creating expectations for technology and procedures that simply didn't exist at Ashcroft. She noticed details I'd initially overlooked or accepted without question: the lack of digital systems, the handwritten records, the unusual supply inventory, the specialized medical equipment, the protective symbols on doors and walls. Her corrections experience was more recent than mine, and she expected standardized procedures, computer databases, digital communication systems, and regulatory compliance mechanisms that were incompatible with Ashcroft's unique operational requirements. The facility's methods seemed primitive to someone accustomed to modern prison management, despite their effectiveness in handling challenges that conventional corrections couldn't address. "This place feels like a museum," she whispered to me, during a moment when Dr. Croft was occupied with a maintenance issue that required her immediate attention. "How do you file reports without computers? How do you communicate with headquarters? Where are the federal inspectors, the oversight committees, the accountability mechanisms that ensure operations comply with constitutional requirements?" I found myself defending Ashcroft's procedures with enthusiasm that surprised me, explaining the practical advantages of analog systems and specialized protocols with conviction that hadn't been part of my conscious thinking before speaking. The facility's methods had proven effective over decades of operation, handling challenges that digital systems couldn't accommodate, and maintaining security in circumstances that conventional oversight couldn't understand. Digital systems would introduce vulnerabilities that analog equipment avoided, creating security risks that could compromise not just facility operations but national security interests that encompass threats beyond normal criminal activity. The specialized nature of our mission required approaches that conventional corrections couldn't accommodate, procedures that had been developed through decades of experience with phenomena that exceeded normal human understanding. Elena's skepticism seemed almost quaint, like someone questioning the necessity of security procedures at a maximum security prison, or wondering why nuclear facilities required special protocols that differed from normal industrial operations. She'd understand eventually, once she spent more time with the inmates and began to appreciate the complexity of what we were dealing with. Her first encounter with the cell blocks proved particularly challenging, revealing resistance factors that would complicate her integration timeline significantly. Unlike my gradual introduction to the inmates' unusual characteristics, Eleanor was immediately confronted with phenomena that violated her understanding of human behavior and challenged her military training regarding prisoner management. Thomas Henley greeted her by name before introductions could be made, then proceeded to describe her military service record with accuracy that should have been impossible, given the classified nature of her background. Elena had served as a medic in Afghanistan, information that wasn't in any of the files she would have had access to, treating wounded soldiers in combat situations that hadn't been documented in unclassified records. "Gunnery Sergeant Martinez," he said through his cell door, using a rank she'd held for only 6 months before her medical discharge following an incident that had never been officially reported. "You treated 17 wounded soldiers during the attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman. You saved 12 lives that day, but you still hear the voices of the 5 who didn't make it." Elena went pale, backing away from his cell as if she'd been physically struck by information that couldn't have been obtained through normal intelligence gathering. The incident at FOB Chapman wasn't in her official military records because it had been classified at levels that civilian corrections officials shouldn't have been able to access, involving casualties that had resulted from encounters with phenomena that military authorities couldn't explain or acknowledge. Rebecca Walsh's reaction was even more dramatic, beginning to recite details about Elena's medical training that included specific cases she'd encountered during her rotation through a psychiatric emergency department. Cases involving victims of what appeared to be ritualistic violence, individuals whose injuries followed patterns that suggested knowledge of human anatomy that exceeded normal criminal capability. "Dr. Martinez," Rebecca said with the kind of professional courtesy she might have used in a hospital setting, speaking with authority that belonged to someone with decades more experience than her apparent age could account for. "You'll remember the patient they brought in during the winter storm of 2019. The young man who spoke in languages that linguists couldn't identify, describing events that hadn't happened yet but did happen, exactly as he predicted, within weeks of his admission." The case Rebecca referenced had never been officially documented because it involved phenomena that psychiatric authorities couldn't explain within conventional medical frameworks. Elena had been forbidden from discussing it with anyone, but the memories haunted her dreams and influenced her decision to leave medical practice for corrections work. By the time we reached David Pratt's cell, Eleanor was barely maintaining professional composure. David didn't speak to her directly, but he began reciting what sounded like medical case histories in a voice that carried clearly through the steel door. Cases involving patients who displayed impossible physiological characteristics, victims of crimes that defied logical explanation, individuals whose conditions challenged everything Elena thought she knew about human biology and psychology. The cases he described matched experiences from Elena's medical training that had been classified or suppressed, encounters with patients whose conditions couldn't be explained by conventional medicine, but had shaped her understanding of human potential in ways she'd never been able to discuss with colleagues or superiors. "I need to make a phone call," Elena announced when we'd finished the tour, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to bureaucratic compliance in emergency situations. "I need to contact my supervisor at the Bureau of Prisons immediately." Dr. Croft explained gently that external communications were restricted during the orientation period, standard security protocol for specialized facilities handling classified materials that required controlled information flow to prevent security breaches. Elena would be able to contact her previous supervisors after completing her initial training and security briefings, once she'd received appropriate clearances for discussing classified operations. The restriction didn't satisfy Elena, and her agitation became more pronounced over the following days as she realized the extent to which normal administrative procedures had been suspended for personnel working at Ashcroft. She questioned every protocol, challenged every policy, demanded explanations for operational methods that I'd come to see as obviously necessary for managing the facility's unique requirements. Her resistance to facility procedures reminded me of my father's stories about miners who couldn't adapt to working underground, individuals whose psychological makeup was incompatible with the deep places where normal rules didn't apply. Some people, my father had said, were meant to live in sunlight and open air, maintaining illusions about reality that couldn't survive in environments where the truth was more complex than surface appearances suggested. The mines claimed resistant workers eventually, one way or another, but they fought the adaptation process every step of the way, creating suffering for themselves and complications for colleagues who were trying to help them survive in circumstances that required different approaches to consciousness and reality. Elena was fighting the integration process with determination that made adaptation more difficult for herself and more stressful for the staff trying to help her. During her first week, she developed physical symptoms that Rebecca Walsh had predicted: insomnia, loss of appetite, headaches that seemed to worsen in proximity to certain cells, and nervous system reactions that suggested her body was rejecting environmental factors that other personnel adapted to naturally. I tried to reassure her that the symptoms were temporary, part of the natural adjustment to working in a specialized environment that operated according to principles that differed from conventional corrections facilities. The underground location, unique acoustic properties, electromagnetic characteristics, and atmospheric conditions required physiological adaptation that took time to develop, but the process was well documented and manageable with proper support. "This isn't natural," she insisted, during one of our conversations in the break room, surrounded by furniture that had been accumulating stains and wear for decades. "Whatever's happening to me, whatever's happening to the staff here, it's not normal human adaptation to environmental factors. People don't just adjust to hearing voices and seeing things that aren't there." Her perspective was understandable, but limited by conventional medical and psychological frameworks that couldn't account for the realities of working with consciousness entities that existed partially outside normal human perception. The phenomena she was experiencing weren't symptoms of illness, but evidence of expanding awareness, sensitivity to aspects of reality that most people couldn't perceive because they hadn't been exposed to the right conditions or received appropriate guidance. The inmates were trying to help her, offering the same assistance they'd provided me during my early weeks at Ashcroft, but Elena interpreted their communications as harassment or psychological manipulation. She filed formal complaints about inappropriate contact between staff and inmates, demanding investigations into security breaches that existed only in her misunderstanding of facility operations and the nature of the entities we were dealing with. Her complaints focused on violations of conventional prison regulations that didn't apply to Ashcroft's specialized mission, citing policies that had been suspended or modified for personnel working with consciousness phenomena that required different approaches to containment and communication. The regulations she wanted enforced would have made effective facility management impossible, preventing the kind of interaction that was necessary for maintaining operational stability. Dr. Croft handled Elena's complaints with patience that seemed infinite, but I could see the strain it was causing on overall facility operations. Managing resistant staff members required resources that could be better used for actual security needs, training programs that could help other personnel develop their capabilities, and research activities that contributed to understanding the phenomena we were dealing with. Elena's integration timeline was falling behind schedule, creating complications for long-term operational planning that depended on maintaining appropriate staffing levels with properly trained personnel. Her resistance to The adaptation process was affecting other staff members, creating doubt about procedures that required confidence to implement effectively. Administrator Stone visited again during Elena's second week, appearing in the conference room where she was reviewing personnel files and preparing what looked like a comprehensive report documenting facility violations of federal regulations that didn't apply to our classified operations. "Dr. Martinez," he said with the same warm authority he'd used with me, but Elena's reaction was immediate and hostile rather than receptive. She accused him of running an illegal detention facility, of holding federal employees against their will, of conducting unauthorized medical experiments on both staff and inmates without informed consent or regulatory oversight. Her accusations were delivered with the kind of righteous indignation that would have been appropriate if they'd been accurate, but they demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of Ashcroft's legal authority, operational requirements, and the nature of the entities we were managing. The facility operated under classified directives that superseded normal regulatory frameworks, handling threats to national security that conventional authorities couldn't address. Administrator Stone listened patiently to her concerns, taking notes in his leather-bound book with the careful attention of someone accustomed to handling difficult personnel situations that required delicate psychological management. When she finished her accusations, he explained the legal framework that authorized Ashcroft's operations, the security requirements that justified our unconventional procedures, and the classified nature of our mission that required personnel to accept certain limitations on their normal rights and freedoms. "You're free to leave at any time," he assured her with sincerity that carried legal weight. "No one is being held against their will, and any employee who finds our operational requirements incompatible with their personal values or professional ethics can terminate their employment immediately." However, the security briefings she'd received during her orientation required certain protocols if she chose to end her association with classified operations. The procedures involved extensive debriefing sessions, psychological evaluation to ensure she hadn't been compromised by exposure to information that could affect national security, and ongoing monitoring to verify that no breaches occurred after her departure from active duty. The clearance process typically took several months and required temporary residence at a secure facility until security reviews could be completed and appropriate measures implemented to prevent unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The procedures were standard for personnel with access to operations that involved national security implications. Elena's choice was essentially between accepting her position at Ashcroft with its unique requirement and accepting an extended stay at another secure facility while a termination was processed according to security protocols that prioritized national security over individual convenience. Neither option involved returning immediately to her previous life, but one offered the opportunity for meaningful work in an environment that could utilize her skills and experience. She chose to remain at Ashcroft, but her integration continued to proceed poorly despite access to the same support resources that had facilitated my successful adaptation. The physical symptoms worsened rather than improving, and she began experiencing what she described as auditory and visual hallucinations that interfered with her ability to perform routine duties. Voices calling her name from empty cells, conversations in languages she couldn't identify but somehow understood, visual distortions that made familiar corridors seem to extend into impossible distances. The phenomena she reported matched experiences that other personnel described as normal adaptation to enhanced awareness, but Elena's interpretation remained focused on pathology rather than development. I tried to explain that the experiences weren't hallucinations but evidence of heightened sensitivity to the facility's unique characteristics, capabilities that allowed personnel to perceive and interact with aspects of reality that conventional awareness couldn't access. The inmates communicated through methods that conventional medicine didn't recognize, using frequencies and modalities that required adaptation to perceive properly. My explanations only increased her distress, confirming her belief that the facility was causing psychological damage rather than facilitating beneficial adaptation. She began documenting everything she experienced, compiling evidence for what she believed would be a future investigation into illegal activities at the facility. Her notes filled several notebooks with observations that would have been valuable for operational improvements if they'd been offered constructively rather than as accusations of misconduct. The documentation process became obsessive, consuming time and energy that could have been directed toward learning the skills she needed to function effectively in her position. Elena photographed everything with a camera she'd somehow obtained, despite restrictions on electronic devices, recording conversations with staff members who were trying to help her, and measuring electromagnetic readings with equipment that shouldn't have functioned properly in Ashcroft's unique environment. Her investigative approach revealed intelligence and analytical capabilities that would have served her well if directed toward understanding facility operations, rather than building a case against them. The same attention to detail that made her an effective corrections inspector was preventing her from accepting information that contradicted her preconceptions about how reality was supposed to function. 3 weeks into her tenure, Elena attempted to leave the facility without authorization, making it as far as the surface entrance before Morrison intercepted her with the gentle but firm professionalism he'd developed through years of handling difficult situations. She claimed she was feeling ill and needed fresh air, but her backpack contained notebooks, photographs, and recording devices that suggested more comprehensive plans. Morrison escorted her back to the administrative level for a meeting with Dr. Croft, who handled the incident with clinical compassion while documenting behaviors that suggested Eleanor was experiencing what the medical files called catastrophic integration failure. The condition occurred when individuals were fundamentally incompatible with facility operations, creating psychological stress that interfered with their ability to function effectively in any capacity. The incident prompted a comprehensive review of Elena's psychological profile and adaptation timeline, revealing factors that should have been identified during the selection process but had been overlooked or misinterpreted. Elena was experiencing resistance patterns that indicated biological incompatibility with the environmental factors that facilitated enhanced awareness in other personnel. Previous cases of integration failure had been handled through transfer to specialized medical facilities where affected personnel could receive appropriate treatment for conditions that conventional medicine couldn't diagnose or address effectively. The process was unfortunate but necessary when individuals couldn't adapt to Ashcroft's unique requirements through normal support methods. Dr. Croft explained the situation to Eleanor with clinical compassion, describing the transfer as a medical necessity rather than disciplinary action. Elena would receive the best possible care from specialists who understood the challenges of working in classified environments that exposed personnel to phenomena beyond normal human experience. "You're not the first person who's had difficulty adapting," Dr. Croft assured her, reviewing medical records that documented similar cases from previous years. Some people are naturally resistant to the kinds of perceptual changes that our environment induces. It's not a personal failure or character defect, just biological incompatibility that can't be overcome through willpower or training. Elena's response was to demand immediate release, threatening legal action if she wasn't allowed to leave within 24 hours and return to her previous position with the Bureau of Prisons. Her threats were delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to bureaucratic compliance, but they carried no weight in the specialized legal framework that governed classified operations like Ashcroft. Administrator Stone handled her final interview personally, arriving at the facility with transport arrangements and paperwork for her transfer to what he described as a transitional care facility, where she would receive comprehensive medical and psychological support. The facility specialized in helping personnel who had been exposed to classified operations that involved phenomena beyond conventional understanding. Eleanor would receive the best possible care while the security implications of her exposure to classified information were evaluated by specialists who understood both the medical and legal aspects of her situation. The process would take time, but she would be comfortable and well treated throughout the transition period. I watched her departure from the administrative level, feeling a combination of sadness and relief that surprised me with its intensity. Elena's resistance to integration had created stress throughout the facility, disrupting routines that had been carefully developed over decades to maintain operational stability. Her transfer would restore the harmony necessary for effective management of the entities that depended on facility operations for their continued containment. Some people aren't meant for the deep places, I found myself saying, echoing my father's words about miners who couldn't adapt to working underground where different rules applied, and conventional reality became inadequate for survival. Morrison nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd witnessed similar departures over his 15 years at Ashcroft. Personnel who'd been selected with care but proved incompatible with the facility's unique requirements, despite everyone's best efforts to facilitate their adaptation. She fought too hard against the process, he observed, with the wisdom that came from years of watching people adapt or fail to adapt to working with consciousness entities. Made it worse for herself than it needed to be. Sometimes the harder you fight against something, the more it hurts. Dr. Croft joined us as Elena's transport disappeared into the forest, making final notes in the file she'd maintained throughout the failed integration attempt. Her documentation would help improve the selection process for future candidates, identifying resistance factors that should disqualify applicants before they were exposed to phenomena that could cause psychological damage. The next candidate shows better compatibility markers, she informed me, consulting her clipboard with the efficiency that had characterized her work throughout my tenure. Dr. Patricia Williams, formerly with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, her psychological profile suggests much better adaptation potential than Dr. Martinez demonstrated. The prospect of training another replacement filled me with anticipation rather than apprehension, informed by lessons learned from Elena's experience that would help me provide better guidance to future personnel. Elena's resistance had taught me valuable insights about the integration process. Understanding that would help me recognize early warning signs and provide more effective support. The inmates had observed Elena's departure with what seemed like sympathy rather than satisfaction, recognizing that her inability to adapt represented a failure of the system rather than personal inadequacy. During the evening roll call, they offered observations about the challenges of human adaptation that suggested genuine concern for individuals who couldn't accept the facility's gifts. Not everyone can hear properly, Thomas Henley noted during our corridor conversation, speaking with the compassion of someone who understood the tragedy of limited perception. Some people's minds are closed to experiences beyond their previous understanding. It's unfortunate for them, but not uncommon in the general population. Rebecca Walsh added her medical perspective with clinical accuracy. Fear and resistance create physical barriers to integration that become self-reinforcing. When someone fights the process too hard, their body rejects the beneficial changes, creating symptoms that confirm their worst fears about what's happening to them. David Pratt provided the philosophical context that encompassed broader implications. Each person must choose their own path to understanding. Dr. Martinez chose to remain limited by conventional thinking, rather than expanding her awareness to encompass larger realities. Her suffering was the natural consequence of that choice, not something imposed on her by external forces. Their observations helped me understand that Elena's failure hadn't been anyone's fault, simply the result of incompatibility between her psychological makeup and Ashcroft's requirements. Future personnel selections would need to account for resistance factors that hadn't been adequately evaluated in her case, identifying individuals whose belief systems and personal experiences would facilitate, rather than hinder, adaptation to enhanced awareness. Administrator Stone visited again the following week, bringing preliminary files for Dr. Patricia Williams and discussing improvements to the integration protocol based on lessons learned from Elena's experience. The evaluation had revealed factors that should have predicted her resistance to adaptation, insights that would help prevent similar failures in future personnel selections. Dr. Martinez's case was unusual in its severity, he explained, reviewing her psychological evaluation with clinical detachment that suggested extensive experience with personnel management challenges. Most staff members experienced some initial resistance to facility operations, but her level of opposition indicated underlying factors we hadn't anticipated during the selection process. The evaluation had revealed religious beliefs and personal experiences that created fundamental conflicts with Ashcroft's operations, making her psychologically incapable of accepting the reality of consciousness entities that existed beyond conventional understanding. Elena's military service had involved encounters with phenomena she'd categorized as demonic or supernatural, creating a religious framework that interpreted everything at Ashcroft as malevolent rather than neutral or beneficial. Her medical training had included exposure to cases involving unexplained phenomena, but instead of developing scientific curiosity about consciousness that transcended normal human limitations, she'd developed fear-based responses that classified such experiences as pathological rather than evolutionary. Future screening would include more comprehensive evaluation of candidates' belief systems and previous exposure to unexplained phenomena, identifying individuals whose psychological frameworks would facilitate rather than hinder adaptation to working with consciousness entities. Personnel with rigid religious convictions or traumatic experiences involving supernatural events would be considered poor risks for successful integration. Dr. Patricia Williams's files suggested much better compatibility with Ashcroft's operational requirement than Elena had demonstrated. Her corrections background included extensive work with mentally ill inmates displaying unusual behavioral patterns that conventional psychiatry couldn't explain adequately. She'd investigated several cases involving unexplained phenomena and had demonstrated scientific curiosity rather than fear when confronted with events beyond conventional explanation. She's asked intelligent questions about the position, Administrator Stone noted approvingly, reviewing correspondence that showed genuine interest in understanding rather than judging facility operations. Her concerns focus on operational effectiveness and professional development rather than regulatory compliance and external oversight, much more promising than Dr. Martinez's approach. The questions Patricia had asked during preliminary interviews demonstrated understanding that specialized facilities required specialized approaches, flexibility in operational procedures that might not conform to conventional standards, and willingness to learn new methods rather than insisting on familiar approaches that might be inadequate for unique challenges. Patricia arrived the following Monday with an attitude markedly different from Eleanor's resistance and suspicion. Where Eleanor had been immediately hostile to anything that deviated from standard procedures, Patricia seemed genuinely interested in learning about Ashcroft's unique mission and the specialized approaches that had been developed to accomplish it effectively. Her questions during orientation focused on practical matters that demonstrated professional commitment, how to best serve the inmates' needs, what training was available for developing specialized skills, how success was measured in such an unusual environment, and what opportunities existed for professional growth and advancement. Her first tour of the cell blocks proceeded smoothly, with reactions that indicated intellectual curiosity rather than fear or resistance. When Thomas Henley greeted her by name and demonstrated knowledge of her career history, that shouldn't have been accessible through normal information channels, Patricia's response was professional interest rather than alarm or defensive hostility. "How do you access that information?" she asked with genuine scientific curiosity, treating the phenomenon as an interesting puzzle rather than a threatening violation. "Is it through some kind of enhanced intuition? Or are you accessing databases we're not aware of? I'd like to understand the mechanism involved." Thomas seemed pleased by her question, responding with the kind of technical discussion he'd attempted with Eleanor, but never been able to complete because of her resistance to accepting information that contradicted her preconceptions. He described perception methods that transcended conventional sensory input, awareness techniques that allowed access to information stored in what he called collective consciousness networks. The explanation involved concepts that conventional neuroscience hadn't developed yet, but Patricia listened with the attention of someone genuinely interested in expanding her understanding, rather than defending existing beliefs. Her corrections experience had prepared her to accept that inmates sometimes possessed knowledge and abilities beyond normal human parameters, making her curious about mechanisms rather than defensive about implications. Patricia took notes during their conversation, treating it as educational rather than threatening, documenting information that could help her understand facility operations more effectively. Her approach demonstrated the scientific mindset that would serve her well in adapting to Ashcroft's unique requirements. Rebecca Walsh's medical insights were received with similar professional interest, building on Patricia's background in corrections psychology and her experience working with inmates whose mental states challenged conventional psychiatric categories. Patricia had encountered cases where mentally ill inmates displayed impossible physiological characteristics, situations where conventional medical knowledge couldn't explain observed symptoms or behaviors. She understood that specialized environments might require specialized expertise, approaches that hadn't been developed by mainstream medicine, but were necessary for dealing with phenomena that existed beyond normal human experience. Her willingness to learn new methods rather than insist on familiar approaches indicated flexibility that would facilitate successful adaptation. David Pratt's philosophical perspectives resonated with Patricia's own interests in consciousness research and alternative psychology, subjects she'd studied independently because conventional corrections training didn't address the complexity of human consciousness in sufficient detail. She'd researched meditation techniques, explored theories about human potential that weren't accepted by mainstream science, and worked with inmates whose mental states suggested capabilities that exceeded normal psychological categories. "This is fascinating," she told me after completing her first cell block tour, her enthusiasm evident in both her questions and her body language. "I've encountered isolated cases of these phenomena before, but never a comprehensive approach to understanding and managing them systematically. The research potential here is extraordinary." Her excitement was infectious, reminding me of my own early enthusiasm about working at Ashcroft before the integration process had made such conscious feelings seem unnecessary. Patricia was experiencing the intellectual curiosity that had drawn me to corrections work originally, the satisfaction of solving puzzles that conventional methods couldn't address effectively. Her adaptation proceeded smoothly over the following weeks, with none of the resistance patterns that had complicated Eleanor's failed integration. The physical symptoms that had plagued Elena were minimal and brief in Patricia's case, lasting only a few days before her physiology adjusted to the facility's unique characteristics without apparent distress. She began hearing the inmates' communications almost immediately, treating them as additional sources of professional information rather than disturbing intrusions that threatened her sanity. Within the first week, she was participating in conversations with Thomas, Rebecca, and David that provided insights into facility operations and consciousness phenomena that would have taken most personnel months to develop. They're remarkably insightful, she observed during one of our status meetings with Dr. Croft, speaking with professional appreciation for expertise that could contribute to her effectiveness. Their perspectives on human behavior and consciousness far exceeded anything I learned in graduate school or professional training. Working with them is like having access to a think tank of consciousness researchers. Dr. Croft made approving notes in Patricia's file, documenting adaptation milestones that suggested excellent long-term compatibility with facility operations. Patricia's integration timeline was proceeding ahead of schedule, indicating that she might be ready for advanced responsibilities sooner than initially projected. The inmates responded positively to Patricia's approach, offering increasingly detailed insights about their conditions and the broader implications of their experiences with consciousness entities. Thomas shared tactical knowledge that helped her understand security considerations she might not have considered independently. Rebecca provided medical perspectives that enhanced her ability to recognize health issues before they became serious problems. David offered philosophical frameworks that helped her integrate disparate observations into coherent understanding of facility operations. She learns quickly, Thomas noted during one of our corridor conversations, speaking with approval that he'd never expressed regarding Elena's progress. Most new staff members require months to appreciate the complexity of what we're dealing with here. Dr. Williams grasped the fundamentals within weeks. Rebecca agreed with his assessment, adding medical observations. Her neural adaptation is proceeding faster than average. Brain chemistry changes that usually take months are occurring within weeks, suggesting biological compatibility that facilitates rapid integration with facility operations. David added his philosophical perspective. She approaches consciousness as a malleable phenomenon, rather than a fixed characteristic. That flexibility allows her to adapt to expanded awareness without the resistance that limits most people's development. Patricia's success made me realize how much Eleanor's failed integration had stressed the entire facility, creating tension that had affected everyone's ability to perform their duties effectively. With Patricia adapting smoothly, operational efficiency improved dramatically. Staff morale increased, inmate cooperation enhanced, and the general atmosphere became more positive than it had been in months. Administrator Stone visited during Patricia's 6th week, conducting his standard evaluation interview with obvious satisfaction as he reviewed her adaptation reports and integration milestones. "Excellent progress," he announced after thoroughly examining her performance files and medical evaluations. "Dr. Williams is demonstrating the kind of natural compatibility we hope for in all our personnel. Her integration timeline suggests she'll be ready for increased responsibilities within the next few months." The prospect of Patricia taking over more of my surface duties created feelings I hadn't expected, a complex mixture of pride in her success, satisfaction with my mentoring efforts, and anticipation for changes that would allow me to focus on more advanced aspects of facility operations. My 18-month timeline was approaching rapidly, and I found myself looking forward to the transition, rather than dreading it. The surface duties that had once seemed challenging now felt routine, limited by conventional administrative requirements that prevented me from fully utilizing the insights I'd gained through the integration process. The lower levels called to me during quiet moments, promising opportunities for more meaningful work with the deeper aspects of Ashcroft's mission. Previous wardens worked there now, serving as guides and mentors for personnel transitioning to enhanced responsibilities. I would join them soon, taking on roles that required the expanded awareness that came with complete integration. Patricia seemed to sense the approaching transition without being told about it directly, demonstrating the enhanced perception that indicated successful adaptation to facility operations. During our meetings, she began asking questions about advanced procedures, long-term operational planning, and strategic considerations that went beyond day-to-day administrative duties. "I feel like there's another level to all this," she said during one of our conversations, speaking with the insight that came from developing enhanced awareness. The inmates hint at deeper purposes, broader context that I'm only beginning to understand. There's more to Ashcroft than what I've seen so far, isn't there? Her intuition was remarkably accurate, confirming that her integration was proceeding even better than the official evaluation suggested. She was developing the kind of enhanced perception that would serve her well in advanced positions, sensitivity to information that wasn't explicitly communicated, but was available to those who knew how to access it. "There are aspects of our mission that become apparent with experience," I told her, using the same careful language Dr. Croft had used with me during my early weeks. "Understanding develops gradually as your awareness adapts to the facility's unique characteristics and operational requirements." The explanation satisfied her curiosity for the moment, but I could see that she was beginning to perceive the broader scope of Ashcroft's operations beyond what surface personnel were normally exposed to. The inmates' communications were becoming clearer to her, their insights more detailed and comprehensive. She was starting to hear voices from the lower levels, faint at first but growing stronger as her sensitivity increased through continued exposure to the facility's enhancement processes. My final weeks as surface administrator were marked by a sense of completion and anticipation that felt like approaching graduation from an extended training program. Patricia's preparation was progressing excellently. The inmates were responding well to her growing authority, and the facility's operations were running more smoothly than they had since my early months when everything had been new and challenging. Administrator Stone made his final evaluation visit on a Wednesday morning, exactly 18 months after my arrival at Ashcroft. He reviewed my performance files with obvious satisfaction, documenting achievements that exceeded initial expectations and demonstrated successful completion of surface training requirements. "You've been one of our most successful surface administrators," he informed me, making notes in his leather-bound book with the care of someone documenting important milestones. "Your integration proceeded smoothly, your mentoring of Dr. Williams has been exemplary, and your operational management has maintained excellent facility efficiency throughout the transition period." The praise felt good, but more important was the sense of purpose it represented, and the anticipation of contributing to aspects of the mission that required capabilities I'd developed through months of adaptation to Ashcroft's unique environment. I had found my calling at the facility, discovered work that utilized abilities I hadn't known I possessed. "Dr. Williams is ready to assume surface administrative duties," Administrator Stone continued, confirming what I'd already observed through my own evaluation of her progress. "Her adaptation has been remarkably smooth, and the inmates have accepted her authority without reservation. The transition should proceed without operational disruption." Patricia's promotion to surface administrator would be announced the following Monday. My transition to the lower levels would occur gradually over the subsequent weeks, allowing me to provide guidance during her adjustment to increased responsibilities, while beginning my own adaptation to enhanced duties that would utilize the capabilities I'd developed through 18 months of integration. The process felt natural and inevitable, like the progression from one phase of life to the next rather than an ending or loss. My father had described similar feelings when he'd been promoted from surface mining to deep shaft operations, moving from familiar work to challenging new responsibilities that required different skills and perspectives. "The deep work is more important," he'd told me during one of our conversations about his mining career, "but it changes you in ways you can't understand until you experience them. Most men aren't suited for it, but those who are find it more satisfying than anything they've done before." His words carried new meaning as I prepared for my own transition to deeper levels, where the real work of managing consciousness entities would utilize everything I'd learned during surface training, while requiring capabilities that could only be developed through direct experience with phenomena that transcended normal human understanding. My final morning roll call as surface administrator proceeded with ceremonial significance I hadn't anticipated, taking on the weight of ritual that marked important transitions in facility operations. The inmates' responses carried a tone of celebration rather than routine acknowledgement, as if they were marking an important milestone in my development and their own continued relationship with facility personnel. "Warden Greaves," they chorused when I announced my name at the end of the list, their voices harmonizing in ways that filled the corridors with something that sounded almost like music, frequencies that resonated with the facility's architecture and created overtones that seemed to come from the building itself. Patricia observed from the medical station, taking notes with the careful attention she'd learned from Dr. Croft, while developing her own methods for documenting facility operations. Her expression showed understanding rather than confusion, indicating that her integration had progressed to the point where she could appreciate the significance of what was happening. "The transition is beginning," Thomas Henley observed during our final corridor conversation in our current roles, speaking with the authority of someone who had guided many personnel through similar changes. "You're ready for the deeper work, the responsibilities that require complete integration with facility operations." Rebecca Walsh added her medical perspective with clinical precision. "Your physiological adaptation is complete. The changes that seemed strange during your first months are now permanent enhancements that will serve you well in advanced positions where normal human capabilities would be inadequate." David Pratt provided the philosophical framework that encompassed broader implications. "You've moved from managing the surface manifestations of our mission to participating directly in its essential purposes. The difference is like comparing weather observation to climate control." Their observations helped me understand that the transition wasn't just a job change, but a fundamental expansion of my role within Ashcroft's ecosystem, moving from administrative oversight to direct participation in the facility's core mission. The surface administrative duties had been preparation, training that developed skills and perspectives necessary for more important work that required capabilities beyond normal human limitations. That evening, I cleaned out my office with a sense of completion rather than loss, packing personal items that had accumulated during 18 months of surface duty. The files and paperwork that had once seemed crucial now felt like artifacts from a simpler time, when my understanding of Ashcroft's mission had been limited by conventional administrative thinking. Patricia would inherit an operation running at peak efficiency, with procedures refined through months of experience and systems optimized for maximum effectiveness in managing consciousness entities that required constant attention and specialized approaches. My successor would benefit from lessons learned during my tenure, just as I had benefited from the groundwork laid by previous administrators. The rotary phone rang one final time as I was packing my personal items. Administrator Stone's familiar voice carrying warmth and satisfaction that made the transition feel like a graduation ceremony rather than an ending. "Congratulations, Nathaniel," he said, using my first name for the first time during our professional relationship. "You've completed surface training with exceptional results. Tomorrow begins your real work at Ashcroft, the purposes for which you were originally selected." I hung up the phone with anticipation rather than apprehension, looking forward to discovering what the deeper levels held in store and how my capabilities would be utilized in managing aspects of the mission that required enhanced awareness. The voices from below were calling more clearly now, welcoming me to responsibilities I was finally ready to accept. My last night in surface quarters was filled with dreams that felt more like memories than imagination, visions of work that awaited in regions where the boundary between physical and spiritual reality became meaningless, and where previous wardens served as guides for newly integrated personnel. I would help newly enhanced staff members adapt to expanded awareness while managing operations that required capabilities beyond conventional human limitations. The work would be challenging and satisfying in ways that surface administrative duties could never match, utilising everything I'd learned while requiring continued growth and development. The morning brought my final transition, walking through corridors I'd patrolled for 18 months toward an elevator that would take me to levels I'd only heard about in whispered conversations and administrative references. Patricia watched from the administrative station, ready to begin her own tenure as surface administrator with the confidence that came from excellent preparation. The elevator descended past the familiar 6 levels into regions marked only as special projects and advanced operations, but the architecture changed as we went deeper. Concrete gave way to materials I couldn't identify, conventional lighting replaced by sources that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, creating illumination that revealed details invisible under normal conditions. Previous administrators waited at each level, men and women who had completed their own transitions and now served as mentors and guides for newly enhanced personnel. They greeted me with the warmth of colleagues welcoming a long-awaited team member, offering insights about responsibilities that would utilise everything I'd learned during surface training. "Welcome to the real Ashcroft," said a woman I recognised from old personnel photos as Administrator Johnson, the predecessor who had supposedly retired to Florida but was clearly working in enhanced capacity. "This is where the actual work begins." The deeper levels contained facilities and operations that dwarfed everything I'd seen during surface training, revealing the true scope of Ashcroft's mission and my role within it. Research laboratories where the boundaries between science and consciousness exploration dissolved, communication centres that maintained contact with similar facilities worldwide, and containment areas that housed entities whose complexity made surface inmates seem like simple cases requiring basic management. My new colleagues explained Ashcroft's true scope during orientation sessions that lasted for days, revealing an organisation that operated on scales I hadn't imagined while working in surface administration. The facility served as headquarters for a network of operations spanning continents, coordinating responses to consciousness phenomena that conventional authorities couldn't handle through normal channels. The surface prison was merely the visible component of an organisation dedicated to managing humanity's relationship with consciousness, entities that existed beyond normal perception, facilitating evolution toward expanded awareness while maintaining stability during the transition period. Previous administrators hadn't retired or been transferred. They had graduated to responsibilities that required the enhanced awareness developed through integration with facility operations. Everything you experienced during the past 18 months was designed to prepare you for this, explained Administrator Chen, a former surface administrator from the 1990s, who now managed inter-facility communications with enhanced capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. The integration process, the expanding awareness, the growing connection with the inmates, all of it was developing abilities you'll need for advanced operations. My new duties involved coordinating with similar facilities in other regions, managing research projects that explored the interface between human consciousness and non-physical entities, and training personnel who showed potential for eventually joining our enhanced operations team. The work was challenging and satisfying in ways that surface administrative duties could never match, requiring everything I'd learned while demanding continued growth. The inmates I had known as Ashcroft's prisoners were revealed to be teachers and colleagues, entities whose apparent confinement was actually voluntary service in humanity's gradual adaptation to expanded consciousness. They had been preparing me for responsibilities I was now ready to accept, offering insights that would guide my work in dimensions beyond conventional understanding. Thomas, Rebecca, and David greeted me as equals when I visited their level in my enhanced capacity, no longer separated by steel doors and security protocols that had been necessary. During my surface training, they explained their true roles in Ashcroft's mission, consciousness researchers whose apparent possession was actually voluntary, merger with entities dedicated to humanity's evolution toward greater awareness. The surface sees us as dangerous prisoners, Thomas explained during what felt like our first honest conversation, free from the limitations that had constrained our previous interactions. In reality, we're pioneer explorers, volunteers who've chosen to push the boundaries of human consciousness to create pathways others can eventually follow. Rebecca added her perspective with medical authority that encompassed knowledge far beyond conventional training. The medical anomalies, the impossible physiological readings, they represent adaptations that will become normal as humanity evolves beyond current limitations. We're living laboratories testing what's possible when consciousness expands beyond established boundaries. David provided the philosophical context that encompassed cosmic implications. Every species faces evolutionary transitions that require some individuals to venture beyond established limitations and explore new possibilities. We're serving that role for humanity's consciousness development, creating bridges between current restrictions and future capabilities. Their explanations helped me understand why Administrator Stone had monitored potential personnel for decades before bringing them to Ashcroft, identifying individuals capable of adapting to responsibilities that transcended conventional human experience. The facility required people whose psychological and spiritual development prepared them for roles in humanity's evolutionary advancement toward expanded consciousness. My new work involved training candidates who show potential for eventually joining our enhanced operations, individuals whose backgrounds and personalities suggested compatibility with expanded consciousness responsibilities. The selection process was careful and lengthy, requiring years of observation to identify suitable prospects who could adapt to requirements that exceeded normal human capabilities. Patricia's integration continued smoothly during the months following my transition, confirming that she had been an excellent choice for surface administration and eventual advancement to enhanced operations. Her reports indicated exceptional facility management, successful adaptation to expanded awareness, and growing preparation for responsibilities that would eventually require transition to deeper levels. The cycle would continue, with Patricia eventually moving to enhanced operations while training her own replacement according to procedures that had been refined through decades of experience. Each generation of administrators built upon lessons learned from previous personnel, improving integration protocols based on accumulated understanding of human adaptation to consciousness expansion. Years passed in work that felt more like calling than employment, responsibilities that utilized capabilities I was still discovering within myself, while requiring continued development of abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The enhanced operations team coordinated responses to consciousness phenomena worldwide, managed research projects that pushed the boundaries of human understanding, and prepared for humanity's gradual transition toward expanded awareness. Ashcroft served as humanity's training ground for evolutionary advancement, a place where volunteers could safely explore the interface between current limitations and future possibilities. The work was challenging, sometimes dangerous, but essential for preparing our species for changes that were inevitable, whether we prepared for them or not. The facility had been waiting for me long before that letter arrived at my Pittsburgh apartment, recognizing potential I hadn't known I possessed and guiding me through preparation I hadn't understood I was receiving. Every experience, every decision, every moment of adaptation had been leading toward work I was now privileged to perform. In quiet moments between assignments, I remembered my father's words about finding peace in the deep places where different rules applied, and conventional understanding became inadequate for survival. He had understood something about the Earth's hidden dimensions that surface dwellers couldn't appreciate, just as I now understood aspects of consciousness that conventional awareness couldn't perceive. The deep work was, indeed, more important, and it had changed me in ways I couldn't have imagined during my first descent into Ashcroft's corridors. But the changes weren't losses. They were enhancements, expansions of capability that allowed me to serve purposes beyond anything I had previously considered possible. My name was still Nathaniel Greaves, but the person who bore that name had evolved far beyond the federal corrections inspector who had received a mysterious job offer on a Wednesday morning in October. The integration was complete, the real work was ongoing, and the future held possibilities that extended far beyond individual concerns. The morning roll call continued in the depths of Ashcroft, voices calling names of personnel who had transcended conventional human limitations to serve humanity's evolutionary advancement. When my name was called, I answered with pride in work that few would ever understand, but that everyone would eventually benefit from. The prison for possessed souls had become a gateway to expanded consciousness, and I had found my true calling as its warden in dimensions that encompassed far more than surface understanding could contain.